housekeeping items. I think by now we are pretty familiar with Zoom, but in the case you need a refresher, the mute unmute button is in the lower left-hand corner. If you need to dial in, *6 to mute or unmute. Next slide. And if you need to pair phone or audio, there's a click to join audio, and then you will see information about how to enter your ID on the dial pad. Next slide. So again, welcome. My name is Michelle Wilson. I am the Director of Evaluation and Continuous Learning with the National Fund for Workforce Solutions, and my colleague Abbie Langston, and I will be your host for today's webinar and the entire series. And my colleague Abbie Langston will be leading you through the webinars, and our colleague Jonathan Osei will be monitoring the chat section. I apologize. Next slide, Jo. So want to give you, so this is our agenda for today. Obviously, welcome and introductions. We want to provide a brief overview of the Advancing Workforce Equity Project and how we landed here today. And then I will turn it over to Abbie to do a deep dive into the National Equity Atlas. And then we'll have Q&A, and then we'll do a wrap up and just kind of talk about the next steps or the upcoming events. A couple of things as we move through this, because this is going to be pretty data heavy. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, particularly if we're talking about an indicator and you want an answer sooner rather than later, pop it in the chat and we can pause and engage those questions. And there will also be an opportunity to have a discussion and talk more about this data and just the work in general towards the end. So the Advancing Workforce Equity Project. So over the last 2 years, our organizations, the National Fund and PolicyLink, along with Burning Glass and JPMorgan Chase, partnered to produce a series of reports on workforce equity. And over the 2 years, we worked with local leaders to analyze tailored workforce data, identify key drivers of inequity, and prioritize actionable strategies to advance workforce equity through policy, programs, and investments. And this webinar was born, or this webinar series was born out of that work. So we're really excited to share this with you. And this will be part of a larger body of work that we're doing that we'll talk about during the third webinar, which is actually a toolkit. And so this recording will be a part of that toolkit. So who are we? We are the National Fund for Workforce Solutions, and we collaborate with workers, employers, and communities to advance the skilled workforce and promote good jobs and invest in equitable outcomes. And we do that through 4 integrated solutions: activate employers to make jobs better, co-invest for impact, change systems for improved outcomes, and worker success. So those are our solutions, and you can find more on our website about the National Fund and who we are and what we do if you're not familiar. And so we would love to have you stop by and check us out. Next slide. So just go back to the objectives, JL. So I just want to talk about the objectives for today. So advance one more slide. All right, so our objectives for today's webinar obviously is to introduce the National Equity Atlas to you, but we also want to be able to, in doing so, we want to demonstrate how the Atlas can be used to support an equity agenda. We want to provide insight into how data can be used to dissect systemic issues of power and injustice, I should say. And we want to provide a framework for the remaining webinar series for you, so you can scope that out. And we will have everyone who signed up to this webinar will have a resource packet with some information in there and some prep work for the next series, because we really want you to be able to have a hands-on approach to the data and to understand the data. So we'll do that. So with that said, I will turn this over to Abbie and let her get started. So Abbie, it's all you.
Thank you so much. I'll go ahead and share my screen now. Um, And as Michelle mentioned, my name is Abbie Langston. I am a senior associate at PolicyLink. If you're not familiar with our work, we are a national research and action institute headquartered in Oakland, California, but working all across the country with a network of thousands of community-based organizations, leaders in government and in philanthropy to advance racial and economic equity. So that's our mission, that's our why, that's how we met and were able to form a really fruitful partnership with the National Fund for Workforce Solutions. And through my work at PolicyLink, I lead the development of the National Equity Atlas, which is a formal research partnership that we have with the Equity Research Institute at the University of Southern California. We have been working together probably starting about a decade ago to build a comprehensive, deeply disaggregated regional database on a host of equity indicators. And so we originally did this because, you know, in working with advocates and producing our own research and advocacy around equity issues and advancing policy and systems change, we found time and again that most of the data that was available publicly to us was not appropriately disaggregated. So we would have overall outcomes that really masked a lot of the equity issues that we knew our communities and our partners were struggling with. And so we built this database to provide some disaggregation to say, when we're looking at employment or wages or school quality, it's not enough to just understand the difference between different places, although that certainly matters. We also need to be able to look at these indicators by race and ethnicity, and by gender, and by income, and a host of other ways that we really wanted to dig in more deeply and equip folks who are designing programs or advancing policy to make good decisions and to make decisions based on sort of proven data about what equity outcomes we need. And so in 2014, we released the National Equity Atlas, which is sort of our flagship online data tool. We continue to produce our own research for the field. Next week, actually, we're getting ready to release a data dashboard on rent debt and the accumulation of rent debt throughout the pandemic. We work really closely with community partners, as in the Advancing Workforce Equity Initiative, or with campaigns on housing justice or economic justice to advance their work. But really the core of what we do is seeking to democratize access to equity data. So we want to make sure that the data that we have pulled together and that we continue to update and refresh and build out is accessible to folks, and that people can use it in their work. So that is the goal of the National Equity Atlas. And so today I want to spend some time showing you some of the data that we have available. In general, we cover the US as a whole, all 50 states, the 150 largest metro regions, and the 100 largest cities. So those are the geographies that are currently available. As one of the kind of ongoing upgrades, we're planning to also add data for 400 counties. So if you're doing work that makes the most sense at a county level, be on the lookout for that. And so I want to show you the indicators that we have available and then dig into a few that seem really pertinent for workforce systems change, and walk you through how to access the data, how to disaggregate it, how to understand it, and just to get a better sense of what the Atlas has to offer as a tool. This is the way that we begin our work in any partnership, is looking at the data, getting a sense of the lay of the land, looking at trends over time to understand the context that we're dealing with. And the power of disaggregated data is really to help us identify key issue areas, key populations of focus, and also the drivers of inequity. What are the barriers that are in place that continue to reproduce the inequities that we see show up in this data? So when we're looking at key issue areas, the question might be, where is our region falling behind? Where have we maybe lost ground in terms of advancing an equitable workforce? For key populations, we'll start to look at some indicators by race and ethnicity, but maybe even digging in a little bit below that, right? We know, for example, in many, many communities, we will see that the Asian or Pacific Islander population as a whole has really good outcomes compared to other groups. But if you dig within that, because it's a very large and diverse community, you'll see that there are specific subgroups, subpopulations that maybe are not doing so well and facing additional barriers. And so being able to identify those key populations. And then finally, using this data to identify the structural root causes, the systemic drivers of inequity, because those can be really powerful leverage points for change. When we're talking about what does it mean to bake equity into the system rather than sprinkle it on top, you have to do some of that kind of excavation and digging down to root causes. So we're not going to get through all of that today. Today, our goal is really just to introduce the Atlas. I also want to show you a couple of additional tools, places that you might want to look for data. Obviously, I'm biased to our tool, but it doesn't include everything, and there are some other good sources I want to make sure you're aware of. And then we'll have time at the end for some general discussion. But I do want to invite you all along the way as we're kind of doing this tour and walking through. If you have any questions, you don't need to save them for the end. Please feel free to just drop them in the chat, and then I'll try to keep an eye on that. And if I fail, Jonathan will back me up on making sure that we can just pause and kind of talk through the questions that are coming up for folks. So this is the National Equity Atlas. You'll see here actually is kind of a home base for the work that we've done thus far in the Advancing Workforce Equity Initiative. So if you want to take a look at the reports that we have produced in partnership with the National Fund at the national level and also at the regional level, those are all accessible right from our homepage. But where I want to spend most of our time today is in the indicators database. You can see here that we have it divided into 5 general buckets. The first being demographics. We know that in a generation's time, the United States is no longer going to have a single racial ethnic majority. We will be a majority people of color nation. On or around 2044. So being able to understand how demographic change is playing out in your community, whether your city, region, state, is a really important piece of the puzzle here, because we know that as our communities grow more diverse, the costs of racial inequities will only increase. We know that there is not only a moral case, there's not only a social cost to inequity, but there's also an economic cost. And as our communities become more diverse, that's just going to get bigger. So we have a range of demographic indicators that we can look at. We also have a whole series of economic vitality indicators. So you can see that this is a little bit the slant of our research is on economic equity. So we have a range of things around both the economy as a whole, what kinds of jobs are growing, GDP and wage growth, those kind of macroeconomic indicators, but also, and for us, the priority is really indicators that show how people are doing. And we take a really kind of people-focused view of the economy. So understanding earnings, right? What share of workers in a place are earning at least $15 an hour? What are the median wages? Who is experiencing poverty or economic insecurity? Unemployment. So this whole bucket of economic indicators, which is where we'll probably spend most of our time today. We also have a handful of indicators on readiness. So this is, you might think of as sort of the human capital indicator. So looking at things like school poverty, which we know is a predictor of so many life outcomes for people. Disconnected youth. So where are youth not able to participate in school or work? Looking at educational attainment and then the readiness of people to enter the workforce. We also know that place matters, and understanding the spatial dynamics and the kind of place politics is another important key to advancing workforce equity. So how much do people pay for housing? How far away do they live from good jobs? What's sort of the quality of the neighborhoods that they're in? And then finally, we have a couple of indicators that are designed to show the economic benefits of racial equity. One of the main goals of the Atlas when we formed it, when we conceived it, and that remains today, is to make the economic case. There is very clearly a moral case for equity that a lot of other people do as well or better than we do. But we saw an opportunity to make a unique contribution to really try to quantify what is racial inequity costing your economy, your regional economy, your state economy, our national economy. What would we stand to gain if we were able to close these racial gaps in the workforce and ensure that there were no longer racial gaps in employment or wages? I'll tell you that right now, that number for the US as a whole is about $2.5 trillion by our calculation. So it's no small question. And we can also look at that for the regional level. So that's kind of the waterfront of the indicators that we have in the Atlas. It is a living resource. For many years, we were able to include some more health equity indicators, but then the federal government stopped collecting those data sets and we were no longer able to update them. We have a plan for integrating and building out new indicators, including a much stronger focus on workforce, which I'm thrilled about. But this is sort of where we're at right now. So there's a question in the chat about the methodology. So there are a few different sources that we use, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I'm happy to point you to where you can find the answer. So in general, our database is largely based on IPUM's microdata. It's sort of like the individual level data from the American Community Survey. But if you want to understand how we develop the methods and what kind of goes into any given indicator, you can click on the indicator name and click learn more. And that's going to give you all the technical details that you want, Colin. So yeah, and we can, if we have some time at the end, I'm happy to come back to that if there's a particular indicator you have a question about. So with that, I want to just kind of dive into a couple of things here and maybe start with a couple of the indicators that we looked at in the Advancing Workforce Equity reports, although obviously there's a wealth of information here. So maybe we'll look at $15 an hour, and I'm going to go to Raleigh. I saw someone on the call from Raleigh. So when you choose an indicator from the menu up here, you're going to see this basic same page design, page display for any indicator. It starts with a value statement. All workers should earn a living wage, right? That's why this indicator matters. That's why we're reporting it. That's why it's worth tracking. And you can select, as you may have seen me do, you can select the geography type you want to look at. I imagine many of you are going to be focusing on either city or regional level, but certainly if you're doing, state level design or advocacy, you can look at that as well. And then you can choose your geography from the drop-down menu here. And you're going to see for many of our indicators, the first kind of graphic that you're going to see is a trend line, sort of the 30,000 foot view. What's the trend on this indicator? The legend here shows you that the gray bar is for white workers and this orange bar shows workers of color. And over time, since 1980, so over the last 4 decades, what share of workers by race have earned at least $15 an hour in the Raleigh region. A couple of things that kind of jump out immediately is that there's this big gap. There's this tremendous here 25 percentage point gap between workers of color and white workers, and that really hasn't changed much over time. Narrowed a little bit, but the gap remains. More than 4 out of 5 white workers earn at least this kind of basic living wage compared to just 62% of workers of color. So clearly there are some long-standing kind of deeply rooted drivers behind this trend. If you want to get a quick sense of what you're looking at here, we have these kind of buttons at the bottom that tell you what this data shows, what you're looking at, and also why it matters. So one of the things that we hope to do with the Atlas is to provide not only the data, but also a strong equity framing. We know that 2 different people can look at the same chart and draw vastly different conclusions from it. And so we want to bring that equity orientation to everything that we share. But we also know that this level of data is maybe not granular enough to be really helpful when you're coming to the level of identifying who are the key populations, what are the industrial trends that are driving this. And so this breakdown menu is really kind of where the power of the atlas lives. So we're looking now at the trend, but we can also look at this data. We'll look first of all broken down by race, ethnicity. And here's where you begin to see the specificity of those racial gaps. Before we were looking at a broad whites versus people of color. Now we can begin to see exactly for different groups, exactly how deep those gaps are in the share of workers earning a living wage. So wherever possible, we disaggregate for all the major racial ethnic groups that are identified in federal data. So those include white, Black. We combine those of Hispanic, like Hispanic and Latino descent into this Latinx category, Latino, Asian or Pacific Islander, and mixed or other. So all of the folks who identify with two or more races or some other race. In places where there's a large enough Native American population, and we'll see an example of that later, you would also see a pink bar here for Native American. But we have a pretty strict threshold of data reliability. So if you see a group is missing, it doesn't mean we're saying those people don't live there. It means we don't have good enough data to feel like we can draw conclusions based on it. So here we see that just 41% of Latinx workers in the Raleigh region earn at least $15 an hour. So they're less than half as likely as white workers to meet that wage threshold. We can also look at this with a gender lens. So we can understand how kind of gender dynamics and gender wage gaps play into this. And here we report by both race, ethnicity, and gender, which can be an important lens, particularly when you're looking at, occupational crowding and what kinds of jobs certain folks are most likely to have access to. And then I also want to show you, let's see, there may be a couple more things here I'll show you. One that I mentioned earlier was this breakdown by ancestry. So this will default to the Asian or Pacific Islander group, because part of the reason we added this data to the atlas was when we first launched it, and we're sharing it with different organizations and networks and groups, there were in particular a couple of Pacific Islander organizations who came to us and said, thank you, this is a great resource and you need to do better. Like our communities are still invisible in this data at this level. And so we figured out how to incorporate this kind of subgroup data to begin to show some of the diversity within a racial group. So overall, about 80% of Asian or Pacific Islander workers earn $15 an hour, but only 56% of Southeast Asians. In a place where there's a larger and more diverse population, you might see many more subgroups in this. This is kind of a smaller group. But it was really important to us to be able to provide some of those insights, particularly where we're thinking about, how to direct resources to the folks who are experiencing the greatest barriers to economic inclusion. And then we can also look at this indicator by educational attainment. So we know that, education is an important factor in economic security, in employment levels, in pay, but also that it's not a fix. It's not a, what's the word? It's not a panacea. It's not an equalizer. And so being able to disaggregate this data by education level as well as race can be another important view. So here we look at again, the same different racial ethnic groups, but also by educational attainment. So if you remember that overall 41% of Latinx workers earn $15 an hour, that rate is higher for white workers who don't have even a high school diploma. It's 46%. Among folks with some college or an AA degree, so even among people with a 2-year degree or some kind of certificate, you still see these pretty large gaps between the share of white workers and workers of color who earn this kind of wage threshold. So there is a lot of insights that we can glean here. We could easily spend the hour just talking about any one of these charts, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the kind of information that's available, the different ways that we can look at this. I didn't even go through all of these. We have an ancestry breakdown that shows the different experiences between immigrants and US born workers. You can compare Raleigh to other regions in terms of, how many workers are earning this level. So there's a lot of ways to dig in. And when you found a display or a chart that you like or that you think is really powerful, we also want to make it easy for you to kind of export that and do what you will with it. So there are 3 different ways you can download the information here. The first is an image, which will just give you the chart however you've configured it, whatever it is that you want to look at. You can also download a short PowerPoint deck that includes both the chart and some of the framing that we've created around it. Or you can download the raw data in an Excel file. If you want to recreate the chart or you want to show this, displayed in a different way, it's important to us to make sure that it's as accessible and useful as possible. So we have these download options as well as social media share. So that's kind of the basic anatomy of what you can look at with any given indicator in the atlas. Because we think of this as both a data tool and a narrative tool, we want to provide some insights and analysis of what the data is showing, why it matters, why it's happening, right? So what are the kind of systems and structures that are driving the trends, and then what you can do about it, because it's not just data for data's sake, it's really data for advocacy, data for systems change. And so trying to connect folks to the extent that we can to strategies and resources to help move the needle on the indicator that they're looking at. So there are a handful of things that I think could be really interesting here, but I do want to make sure we leave time for Q&A. So I will maybe just show you a couple of other examples, and then if there are other indicators that you would like to see, we can spend some time doing that, or just dig into discussion. So another thing that I think is really important to look at here, and part of the process that we went through in the Advancing Workforce Equity Initiative, is understanding the workforce ecosystem in a kind of expanded way. So thinking about the supports that people need to connect, to find work, to get connected, and to stay connected. And so one of the primary issues that came up in a lot of the places we were working was transportation. So I want to look at our commute time indicator. And maybe I'll go, where else are we? Go to Houston. So again, when you look at commute time, we have a value statement. All workers should have reasonable commutes, whether that means expanding opportunity in low opportunity neighborhoods or expanding access to high quality, affordable transportation. There are lots of ways to get to that result, but this is the result that we believe would constitute equity, or would equate to equity. So we start with this trend looking at the average commute time by race and ethnicity over time. We see that it's actually increased somewhat, slightly. Not big racial gaps that we see at this kind of overall aggregate level. But again, when you want to start to get some of those insights, we need to go and break it down a little bit. So the first place that we always start is by race ethnicity. And you might notice here that there are, again, at least in Houston, not huge racial gaps, not like we see in some other places. But when we start to filter this data a little bit more, we're going to see where those differences do exist. So we can look at commute time, for example, for residents below 200% of the poverty level. So this is how PolicyLink defines economic security or economic insecurity. We know that the poverty level is a really inadequate measure of what it takes to actually meet your basic needs. And so we use 200% of poverty as a slightly better proxy. You can also filter by mode of transportation. So when we're looking here at workers who are below 200% of poverty, for example, let's just take note that the average commute time for Black workers is 28 minutes. When we look at those who rely on public transportation, for Black workers, it's 54 minutes. So that's about twice as long, about twice the commute. And this equates to almost 2 hours unpaid every day just getting to and from work. So how do we know how many workers are sort of impacted by this or kind of fall into that category of relying on public transit versus private car? And that's not a specific breakdown that's available in the atlas, but we do have a car access indicator. Sorry, y'all, give me just a minute. I've been talking too much today. So when we look at car access by race ethnicity, we see that Black households in Dallas are more than twice as likely as the average to live in a house that doesn't have access to a private vehicle. So that means that they're much more likely to rely on public transit, much more likely then to be experiencing these really long commute times. That we see here. Let me get back to where I was. So part of the value that we hope the atlas brings and that we've seen it bring to different communities is the ability to sort of cross-reference these different data sets to really get a picture of who is experiencing particular challenges, and to begin to kind of focus attention on how to meet them.
Abbie, do you want to take a second and get a sip of water?
Yep.
I will
That's what I'm doing now.
Okay, I will just step in for a second and see, Colin, you have a question here about plans to add a census tract level of analysis. We can pick that up on the back end. Any insights and analysis on internet connectivity in an underserved area. We'll hold on to that and see if Abbie has that. But also, if you guys, we asked earlier, if you didn't hop on right at 2:00, that if you drop your location, maybe we'll pull your city. And if there's a particular question that you'd like to see Abbie maybe work through the atlas on, if you want to pop it in the question, we'll take a look at that. All right. So how are you doing, Abs?
I think I'm back. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, Colin, we do have a mapping feature that for many of our indicators does go down to the census tract level. It does not apparently for commute time. But if we want to look at, for example, unemployment, and where's another region that we have folks on the line from? I saw Seattle, I think, in the list.
Seattle, and I saw Arizona. I think it was
Chandler. Okay, great. So if we look at this map in Houston, we have to zoom in here to get to the census tract level, as our handy map is reminding us. And so there are some indicators that we can look at this level of geography. There's actually a pretty cool feature here where maybe you want to look at the unemployment level specifically in communities that are majority people of color. So you can look at, you can filter this map to say, just show me what this data looks like in places that are majority people of color. And might have to zoom back out to find some of those places in Seattle, but to get a sense of some of those spatial dynamics. So for many of the indicators, you'll see a map breakdown here as well. It's a good question. All right, so maybe I'm just going to show one more indicator and then we'll come back. It looks like there are some questions in the chat about building out this tool and what you can do with it. Are there anything you see on the list here that you'd specifically like to look at, or we can just keep it dealer's choice?
And can we use it? Can we use Atlanta as an example?
Sure. Yeah.
I don't see anything. Just for time's sake, dealer's choice.
All right, let's do it. So I'm going to look at working poverty. And when you first see this, you might think you're not sure what working poor means, which is why there is a question mark right next to it. I can tell you that this chart is showing you the share of workers who are both working full-time and earning an income under 200% of poverty. So this is actually a pretty conservative definition. But when we hear about, folks who are working 40 hours a week and still unable to make ends meet, this is kind of the population that we're looking at here. In this trend, we have gone ahead and included not only the white population and workers of color, but all different racial ethnic groups, because we find that there's actually a lot more variability that we want to see. So one of the stories that immediately jumps out to me and probably to you at this chart is this really dramatic increase in the share of Latinx workers, this blue line, who are working poor, rising steadily since 1990. It looks like it's actually more than doubled. So in 1990, 12% of Latinx workers were working full-time and economically insecure. As of 2017, 28%. So this is a place I would definitely want to dig in and learn more and figure out why that is. We know, though, that our definition of economic insecurity is not always the most sort of appropriate one to use. We know that for lots of program eligibility, there are different thresholds, kind of as a percentage of the poverty level. So you can also look at this for the official federal poverty level and also for 100% of the poverty level. So just know that you have both the breakdown menu and then the filters that are available as different ways to kind of view the data and get to the fine grain that you're looking for in particular. We again can look at this by gender, and it's, when we saw that dramatic increase for Latinx workers, we see that there's also this pretty significant gender gap here. 32%, so 1 out of 3 Latinx men in the Atlanta region are working full-time and economically insecure. This is another option or opportunity to view data by ancestry, so those racial subgroups. And I didn't show you this before, but I will now. Again, we always start with the API community. That's what's going to come up first when you click on this filter. We see this overall pretty low rate of 10%. That's significantly higher for Bangladeshi workers, more than 1 out of 4. Also really elevated for Vietnamese workers and Southeast Asian workers overall. You can look at the same data for other racial ethnic groups. So among white workers, only 6% are working poor. But when you look at, for example, those of Middle Eastern or North African ancestry, it's higher by half, actually, 9%, particularly for Iranian workers. So there's a lot of ways to kind of dig in and figure out what the kind of dynamics are at play here. We can also look at this by nativity. So here we are comparing US born to immigrant workers to understand the way that immigration sort of plays into this and into the overall numbers that we're seeing. So there are a lot of different ways to chop this up. We don't obviously include all of these details with the trend line because it would just be too much information. But if you want to get a sense of how this is changing over time, there's also a year filter. So you can compare the share in 2000 to 2010, 2017. You can see, for some groups, those bars change pretty dramatically. Some of them are going up, some are going down. And this is one place where I think being able to download the raw data in Excel is really helpful if you want to chart this in a different way, if there's a particular story that you want to tell. So it always begins by just digging in, sitting with the data, understanding the stories that it's telling us, and then figuring out exactly how that data can be useful, right? Whether you are looking to answer a specific question or if you're really starting with a broad canvas and saying, what is the state of working people in Atlanta, who is facing what kinds of challenges, that this can provide a framework for that. And I think I'll actually stop there rather than showing another indicator, because you all should have, and I can put the link in the chat, you all are welcome and invited to explore the data for your place on your own. I'm real easy to find if you have any questions about it, but I would love to hear if there are questions that have already come in or other things that are coming up for folks that we can spend the next 15 minutes or so talking through.
Abbie, while we're waiting for questions, can you talk a little bit about, so there was an earlier question first about the digital divide. Like, do you have does the atlas cover anything around the digital divide?
It's a great question. So we have included the digital divide in kind of tailored analyses that we've done for specific places. The challenge is that that data is not uniformly available. So we have a pretty high threshold for adding an indicator to the atlas, in that, it needs to be available for the geographies that we've included here. Some states are better than others at collecting certain kinds of data. Sometimes it's data that's only available at the regional level. So it's we know that it's a really important indicator, and so it shows up more in our kind of custom reporting. But we are always on the lookout for new good sources of data. So would love to be able to add that as an indicator. Particularly in thinking about COVID and the recovery, and how to ensure that we advance an equitable recovery. It's, taken on a new kind of urgency, I think.
So taking questions, you can pop them in the chat, or if you would like to unmute and ask directly, that's perfectly okay too. And while we're waiting, Abbie, what do you say to an organization? And obviously the Advancing Workforce Equity, we used a pretty intentional strategy. Again, we'll talk about that and preview the toolkit in the third webinar. But for organizations that are looking to do this work, like, where do they start to even get to the National Equity Atlas? Like, what questions should they be, like, how would you advise?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. We have something on the atlas called data summaries. And this is, I call this kind of the equity story of your city in 6 charts. Let's see. Where else did you say we had people from, Michelle? No, I can't. Austin. That's where I was going to go, right?
We have Broward County, and we have Des Moines, Iowa.
Okay, great. We'll bring that one up next. So if you click on research and then data summaries, this is going to give you a nice kind of gentle introduction before you dive into the deep end of the atlas that kind of pulls together the way that we tell this story. So the first is about demographic change. The face of America is changing. Austin is well ahead of that trend. So you can see here from the chart kind of the specific groups that are contributing to that growth, but that from 1980 to 2017, the share of the population made up of people of color increased from 29% to 47%. So Austin's just sort of on the verge of that people of color majority. We understand that communities of color are driving growth, and to be able to get a sense of where that population change is coming from, what those dynamics are, and then understanding how inequities baked into the economy threaten the future economic prosperity of the region. So we look here at income growth by percentile. And unfortunately, this is a super common story that we see. A lot of these charts have the same shape, which is that income growth is really largely captured by the highest earners. And while more and more people are doing lower wage work, they are seeing very little of the benefits of that growth and that increased prosperity. We look at racial income gaps. So here we're looking at median wage for white workers and people of color. Obviously, when you dig into the indicator itself on the atlas, you can get much more detailed than that. And then we look at educational attainment and thinking about workforce preparedness. So having a sense of what kinds of jobs are growing, what kinds of education they require, and then who within the population is actually acquiring and has access to that level of education. And then finally, we want to kind of, again, quantify what the benefits of equity are. So here we're looking at the projected gains in income by race and ethnicity. But we could, of course, also look at the overall GDP. How much would Austin's economy as a whole grow if we were able to close these racial gaps? So this is a good place to start. And then really just looking at the indicators that we have available that seem most pertinent to the work that you're doing. Certainly for the workforce field, I think the framework that we put together in those reports is really powerful, and many of those indicators are available here in that atlas. In the next webinar next week, we'll be looking at a couple of specific indicators and really digging into, okay, once you've found the data, you have found some numbers that feel really important and compelling, but maybe a little overwhelming, because how do you solve for working poverty, right? How do you solve for persistent employment gaps? And to think through the series of questions that you ask about how do you put that data into action? It's not just about you know, understanding what the numbers themselves are, but what can you do with that? How can you sort of transform it so that it's not just a static point? And maybe while we're chatting, I'm going to show you this GDP indicator I've mentioned a couple times and we haven't talked about. This was one of the points that we included in the workforce equity reports, because it's often, pretty stark. If we were to close racial gaps in income in Des Moines, so that means closing racial gaps in employment and in wages, you can see that the economy there would be about $3.5 billion larger per year. Obviously, the more diverse a place is, the greater this impact is going to have. So if we were to look at somewhere like Los Angeles, I think we had someone here from LA, you can see that the regional economy, obviously it's a huge region, we're not comparing Des Moines and LA, but the actual GDP was just over $1 trillion, could have been $1.6 trillion. So we're talking a $600 billion increase, am I getting that right? If we closed racial income gaps in LA.
Abbie, there's a question about offering training sessions on how to use the Atlas. That's coming from Houston.
Yes, absolutely. So we built this thing with the hopes that people would want to use it, and we know that it's a little bit complicated, and so would love to do that. I will say a good place to start under our data and action tab. There's a trainings menu that is some written resources and some archives of webinars and trainings that we've done. But if you have a particular interest and you would like for your team to be introduced into to be able to dig into some of the insights we have, happy to do that. You can contact us. There's a button here, but it's also just info at National Equity Atlas, and our team would be really happy to set something up with you.
And Abbie, do you have any advice for organizations about who are there? Is there a particular skill set needed for someone to operate the National Equity Atlas, or is it just a matter of getting in there and digging in and learning it? Right. So can you speak to that? Because I think sometimes data can be very intimidating to folks, and like, oh no, I don't have the capacity to do this. So talk a little bit about who can use this and what.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that question. So our hope is that it is very user-friendly and doesn't require any kind of data analysis skill or any particular technical knowledge. It's part of the reason why we designed it to include the different elements that it does. Um, we we trust the kind of wisdom and experience of folks who are working on the ground, that you understand what the issues are that are facing your communities. You know what it is that you want to do. Occasionally, the data provides a kind of epiphany, but more often than not, it's really a way to kind of confirm and help you make the case for things that you already know to be true, right? And so providing the data in the various ways that we do is meant to be super user friendly, designed for folks who are not data scientists. You don't have to be too data savvy, although if you are, we certainly welcome that, and it's part of the reason why we provide the raw data that underlies all of these data sets, so that folks can chop it up in different ways if they want to. But we hope that it doesn't require a whole lot of onboarding. The bigger challenge, in my experience, is just wading through how much data is available, even how much data is available on a single chart, right? And really figuring out the clearest way to message what it is that you want people to see and how you want them to read that data. So, I don't know that we've arrived there yet, but that certainly is our intention.
Okay, I'm just so mindful of the time. If, are there any, pause for a couple of seconds to see if there are, if anything comes to mind that you'd like to ask in this space, and then we'll move on to what sessions 2 and 3 will look like and just close out for today.
And I will also say we can share these resources in follow-up, but there are a couple of other sources that I think for workforce folks in particular could be super useful that I just wanted you to be aware of. The first is this Track the Recovery, which is pulled together by Opportunity Insights, but brings data from a lot of different sources, including our partners at Burning Glass, who were a data partner in the Advancing Workforce Equity Initiative. So they have, we can share the link, they have indicators around spending, businesses, so kind of small business recovery, employment, education, and public health. It's a kind of strong COVID frame. And this is available for states, counties, and lots of metros, although not necessarily equally across the board. But one of the data points we had in our workforce equity reports was around job postings and understanding how they're changing. And so there's a tool here that's available for a lot of other regions that you can compare, what kinds of jobs are coming back, or looking at how employment levels have recovered. You can compare, low income to high income workers to see, who's really recovering, who's coming back. And then for basically any state that you're working in, you should be able to access employment projections data, which we also used pretty extensively. I pulled up a couple examples here. This is what it looks like in Michigan. You can choose long-term projections. You can look at a lot of different data here. For Illinois, I didn't download these zips, but I have used them before. And then I kind of dug down and pulled up this data for Dallas, which is showing projected employment for 10 years, which can be really useful when we want to think about what kinds of jobs are growing and what's going to be sustaining a regional economy. So we can put together these and some other resources to share that I think complement really well the data in the atlas.
Thanks, Abs. We will, and Jo, if you can just pop up the screen for the pop up the PowerPoint with the next. Thank you, Saffron, my dog. The next 2 sessions, but we'll put this in a resource packet. And if you're on, everyone that's here today or who signed up for the webinar, you'll get access to that resource packet, and it will also be a part of the Advancing Workforce Equity Toolkit. But we have two more sessions, and they're the next 2 Wednesdays, and the next one will that we're doing is analyzing systemic drivers of inequity, and so we'll do deep dive on that. And again, this is how we went through the process with the Advancing Workforce Equity Initiative. And then the third session, which is the following Wednesday, is on developing high impact workforce equity strategies. And we'll have one of our collaboratives here to do a deep dive and around how they built out their strategies using this process. And we will preview the Advancing Workforce Equity Toolkit, which again has a large data component to it. So in preparation for that, if you're joining us again over the next couple of weeks, if you have questions, if you think of something and say, hey, can you show us what this looks like for our city? Please drop us a line. You can email Jo, and I'm sure he's going to put his contact information in the chat, or Abbie or myself, and we will organize those questions and see if we can get them. We can respond to them during this one of these webinars. So with that, I thank you all for your time. We will see you next week, and have a great afternoon, everybody. Bye.